before millions of viewers, Carson always appeared with a warm smile, hearty laughter, and a charm that made everyone feel like they were chatting with a close friend. But when the lights went out, when the audience went home, Johnny would whisper bitter words to his close collaborator Ed McMahon. He kept a secret list in his heart, a list of illustrious names, but hiding dark truths. According to the producer's accounts, Carson once sternly said, "This person shouldn't come near the camera, nor near children." It wasn't just about difficult stars. According to Carson, they were truly dangerous people, those who wore masks of fame to hide their evil nature. He recounted to those close to him, there was a female star who stepped onto the stage with a gentle, fragile appearance. But just minutes before, she had cursed out a young assistant to the point where security had to intervene. And there was a male actor who seemed elegant, but Carson had personally witnessed behavior that nearly made him call the police. Carson distinguished very clearly. A person could be eccentric, could be arrogant, even difficult to work with. But someone who abused power to insult, oppress others, to Carson, that was truly evil. In this first part, we will start with the name at the top of the list, a Hollywood icon, a silver screen queen, but also the one who made Carson exclaim, "I've interviewed corpses with more personality." That was Joan Crawford, the star with eyes as cold as ice, a name that once made the whole world admire. On the sofa of The Tonight Show in 1970, she appeared with an elegant demeanor, impeccable poise, and a charming smile that audiences had loved for decades. But Johnny Carson and his crew witnessed a completely opposite image. Even before she set foot in the studio, the discomfort began. Joan sent the crew a 4-page memo, demanding details on every lighting angle, every chair height, and even the room temperature. It had to be exactly 67 degrees. Not more, not less. She brought her own makeup team, despite the show already having award-winning experts. The cruelest truth revealed itself when a young assistant, only 20 years old, accidentally entered the dressing room, bringing her the glass of water she herself had requested. In front of many people, Joan exploded in a terrifying rage. She called the girl a useless idiot, even humiliating her by saying she was only fit to work in some wretched place. The assistant burst into tears and ran out, while Joan casually demanded she be fired immediately. Carson, who was a master at making guests comfortable, was completely powerless. Throughout the taping, he only saw a person as cold as a statue. When the camera's red light came on, Joan transformed into a graceful queen, giggling, answering every question as if rehearsed 1,000 times. But during breaks, her face immediately froze. She wouldn't look at anyone. Absolute silence. After the show, Carson sighed to Ed McMahon, "I've interviewed corpses and felt they had more personality." Years later, when Christina Crawford's memoir Mommy Dearest revealed Joan's abuse of her adopted children, Carson wasn't surprised at all. He just nodded slightly and said, "I believe every word, because I saw who she was in those few short hours." But if Joan Crawford made Carson's spine chill with her cold cruelty, then the next name on the list angered him in a completely different way. That was a music legend. Someone who seduced audiences with a sweet voice, while spreading fear with formidable power. That person was Frank Sinatra, the man who once made millions of American hearts melt with his sweet voice and elegant style. On television, he and Johnny Carson seemed to have a friendly relationship. Sinatra told stories, joked, sometimes even sang for the audience. Carson smiled, polite, as if they were old friends. But that was just an act in front of the cameras. Behind the scenes, Carson had a completely different view. He once told friends, if he weren't a singer, Frank would be a mobster, and sometimes I think he's both. Every time Sinatra came to the studio, the atmosphere immediately tensed. He never came alone. There was always an entourage of about 8 people accompanying him. They weren't artists nor support staff. They were like bodyguards. Or more accurately, like guys you wouldn't want to run into in a dark alley. They spread out across the studio, watching, making the crew feel like they were being monitored in every move. Carson once personally witnessed Sinatra reveal his true nature. One time, the floor manager, a Korean War veteran, was just doing his job by announcing 3 minutes until taping. Sinatra immediately grabbed his collar, pulled him close, and growled, "No one tells me when to go on stage. I go when I want." The manager was stunned. The whole studio fell silent. Carson, from the control room, was so furious he almost canceled the taping right then. Only the producer's persuasion that the audience was waiting and ratings would explode kept him going. But Sinatra's contempt didn't stop there. During a break, he mocked a female staff member's appearance. This time, Carson didn't hold back. He turned and said coldly, "Here, we don't talk about my staff like that." The atmosphere was so heavy the whole studio held its breath. Sinatra was surprised to be confronted, but Carson maintained absolute composure on air. After that day, Carson made a rare decision. "I don't care about ratings. Limit him to 1 appearance per year." And for someone like Carson, who almost never interfered with booking guests, this was clear proof of the disgust he felt for Sinatra. A music legend, a cultural icon, but in Carson's eyes, he was also a bully, accustomed to using power to subdue others. And to Carson, that was unforgivable. Yet if Sinatra made Carson uncomfortable with his power threats, then the next character was a completely different challenge, not violence, not insults, but an enormous ego disregarding all rules. That was the cinematic genius, Orson Welles, the man behind the masterpiece Citizen Kane, always appearing on television with a booming voice, majestic presence, and captivating stories as if he were recounting history from his own heart. Audiences were mesmerized, while Johnny Carson had to suppress his irritation behind a polite smile. The problem wasn't the talent. Carson immensely respected Welles's greatness, but what he couldn't tolerate was this man's oversized ego. Even before the taping began, the crew was already exhausted. Any list of questions the writers prepared for Carson was ruthlessly crossed out by Welles. He sneered, "These questions are too mundane, too obvious." And then Welles handed back a blank sheet of paper. Carson, who was always meticulous in building the flow of conversation, now had to interview one of cinema's greatest figures without any script framework. And when Welles started talking, he didn't stop. One time, Welles was scheduled for 7 minutes. The result? He took up nearly 25 minutes on air, ignoring all subtle signals from Carson, ignoring cues from the director. 2 other guests had to be canceled that night. For the crew, it was a nightmare. For Carson, it was humiliating. It didn't stop there. Welles acted as if he were the show's director. He directed the cameras, told staff to adjust lighting, even stood up to demand a change in angle. A producer recalled, Johnny was furious but stayed silent on air. When the cameras were off, he just said one sentence, "Genius is not an excuse to hijack someone else's show." For Carson, a perfectionist who loved the balance and rhythm of television, Welles was the perfect example of talent swallowed by ego. The public saw a master storyteller, but Carson saw a man who believed rules didn't apply to him. After his final appearance, Carson told Ed McMahon straight, "Never again. He thinks he's ruling Rome." That was the sentence for a genius, but also for someone who broke all boundaries of respect. If Orson Welles made Carson tired with his inflated ego, then the next guest stunned him in a different way. Because this time, it wasn't just arrogance, but sharp attacks, as if turning the studio into a courtroom. And the one bringing that interrogation was Bette Davis, the Queen of Bitterness, a name associated with angular beauty, sharp eyes, and legendary roles. On The Tonight Show, she stepped out with grace, wit, and a series of golden Hollywood stories. Audiences laughed, admired. But Johnny Carson sat there, thinking to himself, "This isn't a conversation, this is an interrogation." Carson once whispered to Ed McMahon after a taping, "She doesn't need a stage. She needs a courtroom. And anyone sitting next to her needs to hire a lawyer to defend themselves." Davis had a habit that terrified the whole crew. If there were multiple guests on the show, she would find every way to dominate. When others were telling stories, especially young actors or women, Davis would interrupt, even turn her back as if they didn't exist. Viewers saw her clever banter, while Carson saw jealousy and a suffocating desire to control the stage. Behind the scenes was even heavier. Davis always demanded a bottle of whiskey in the green room before going on air. After a few drinks, the bitter words started pouring out. She once rejected a makeup artist, disparaging, "Your hands are shaking like a 3-day drunk." Many female staff still remembered Davis often using sexist, even racist language, making the atmosphere freeze. Carson was someone who avoided confrontation, but one time he had to step in. When Davis berated the cue card holder for being slow, Carson approached and said quietly but firmly, "On this show, we talk to everyone with respect. If not, we don't talk at all." The whole studio went silent. Davis was stunned. The first time someone stopped her. What made Carson particularly uncomfortable was that he truly admired Davis's talent. She was a legend, undeniable, but at the same time she was a storm of words that could sweep away the comfort that was the soul of The Tonight Show. After her last appearance in the 80s, Carson sighed to the producer, "Enough. Life's too short to sit through verbal whippings, no matter how many golden statues she has." And with Bette Davis, Carson faced verbal bitterness. But then, another guest took things further. Not just words, but unacceptable actions. That person was once a shining child star, a box office icon. But as an adult, he became a burden to any show due to uncontrolled behavior and harassing attitudes toward women. That was Mickey Rooney, a name once hailed by all of America, the bright child star of Hollywood's golden era, who topped the box office for 3 consecutive years, from 1939 to 1941. But when he appeared on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson in the 70s, what remained was only a fragment of glorious memory, covered by chaos, drunkenness, and unforgivable behaviors. Carson, after a tense taping, exclaimed to the producer he thinks his shortness allows him to be a pervert. Many female assistants in the crew recounted that they often requested shift changes as soon as they knew Rooney would be a guest. He had a habit of touching hands, holding on longer than necessary, and making inappropriate suggestions. A former assistant forever remembered Rooney grabbing her wrist when she just brought water, then asking in a half-joking, half-serious voice, "Are you married yet?" That discomfort repeated to the point where many saw Rooney as a mobile nightmare. Worse, Rooney often appeared tipsy, at least 3 times. He stepped on stage, slurring, eyes glassy. A 1977 taping even became a shame. He started recounting a memory about Judy Garland, but the story quickly slid into sensitive details to the point Carson had to interrupt, change the topic immediately. During the break, Carson frustratedly asked, "Is he drunk or is this his real self?" What disappointed Carson most was the generational difference. Rooney grew up in 1930s, 40s Hollywood, a world where harassment was often overlooked, even seen as normal. But Carson was different. He had clear moral boundaries, especially regarding respect for women and backstage staff. One time, Rooney made a suggestive comment to a young female actor who was a guest on the same show. Carson apologized to her after the program ended, saying, "That's not how a professional behaves, and it won't happen again." From then on, Rooney was rarely invited back. If he was, Carson only agreed to daytime tapings, under tight control, as a way to minimize risks. To Carson, Mickey Rooney wasn't just an annoying guest, but a reminder that childhood stardom could easily turn into darkness when one loses moral boundaries. And if Rooney made Carson tired with his harassing and chaotic behaviors, then the next name on the list was another nightmare, this time not drunkenness or harassment, but excessive, irrational demands that exhausted the whole crew. That woman was Zsa Zsa Gabor, the star of luxury and haughtiness. On television, she was a seductive diva, witty with her distinctive voice, always making audiences laugh with jokes about love and her endless string of marriages. But for Johnny Carson and the crew, every appearance of hers was nothing short of a nightmare. Carson once bluntly quipped, "I'd rather interview a cat. At least it doesn't need 3 assistants and an entire separate lighting system." Zsa's demands started right from signing the contract. She required the green room to be kept at exactly 74 degrees, not more, not less. On the table, there had to be fresh orchids, absolutely no carnations, a bottle of Perrier with exactly 3 ice cubes, and the scariest, she demanded to fly in her own lighting specialist from Beverly Hills to design lighting just for her. Not only that, Zsa imposed a bizarre clause. No female guests under 40 years old could be scheduled on the same show. If the condition wasn't met, she was ready to lock herself in the dressing room, refusing to go on stage, making the whole crew scramble. One time, upon discovering the makeup room didn't have her preferred foundation, Zsa screamed in the makeup artist's face and demanded someone immediately drive to Beverly Hills to buy it. No one dared intervene. In the end, Carson himself had to call to calm her. "Zsa, you're already radiant. We don't need to turn foundation into a national disaster." What irritated Carson wasn't just the personal hassle, but how she disrupted the entire schedule. Other guests had to wait. Staff worked overtime, and the whole crew was thrown into chaos just to please a star accustomed to being pampered. After a tense taping, Carson muttered, "Next time, let's rename the show The Tonight Show starring Zsa Gabor, and I'll be her sidekick." Yet, audiences loved her. Every time Zsa appeared, ratings soared. That was why Carson reluctantly accepted. He knew well, behind the stage lights, she was an unruly diva, but in front of the camera, she was an undeniable entertainment star. If Zsa made Carson tired with her unreasonable demands, then the next guest brought a completely different worry, because this time the issue wasn't haughtiness, but unpredictable explosions. A emotional bomb that could turn a fun chat into a heated debate. That woman was Shelley Winters, twice an Oscar winner, a veteran Hollywood actress. To audiences, she was a strong, graceful woman, sometimes explosive but always interesting. But to Johnny Carson and the Tonight Show crew, Shelley Winters was like an emotional bomb. No one knew when it would go off. Carson once sighed after a taping. "She doesn't converse, she erupts. Sitting next to Shelley is like trying to control a tornado." Home viewers might see Winters as humorous, frank, full of personality, but for the crew, every appearance was a gamble, because no one could predict if she'd share a fascinating film anecdote, or suddenly launch into a 5-minute rant about government corruption or the Vietnam War. One time, Carson just lightly asked about her new film, and right after, Winters poured out an angry monologue on politics. Carson, the master of situation control, could only smile awkwardly, trying to pull the show back to a light atmosphere. A show director recounted, "With Shelley, Johnny couldn't steer the conversation. He could only sit there, waiting for the storm to subside." But what worried the crew most was her explosive temperament physically. Shelley was famous for once throwing a glass of wine in the actor Oliver Reed's face on British TV when he made rude remarks. So, every time she came to the Tonight Show, backstage staff would quietly clear the table, hide any throwable objects. Carson, though uncomfortable, still gave her a certain respect, because unlike many fake guests, Winters was at least honest with her emotions. After one time, she publicly criticized the war on air. Carson told the producer, "I wouldn't want to vacation with her, but I believe every word she says." However, the unpredictability made Carson gradually limit inviting Winters back. He understood that audiences wanted entertainment, not to be swept into sudden rage. To Carson, Shelley Winters was a reminder that Hollywood wasn't all lights and laughter, but also voices too strong to be restrained. If Shelley Winters confused Carson, with her unpredictable explosions. Then the next name on the list brought an even more uncomfortable feeling. Not just temper, but extreme views, full of prejudice, aimed straight at vulnerable communities. That was Jane Russell, the sensual icon of the 40s, but also someone Carson couldn't accept due to her discriminatory attitude. She was the star of The Outlaw and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, loved by audiences for her strong yet classic allure. But behind the scenes of The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson saw a different person, and that led him to cross her off the guest list. Carson was someone who maintained a neutral stance in politics. He rarely brought divisive issues into the show to keep audiences entertained and comfortable. But with Jane Russell, that boundary was crossed. She didn't just express extreme conservative views, but turned them into personal attacks. Backstage staff still remembered one evening in the early 70s. When entering the makeup room, Russell saw a gay makeup artist and immediately refused. "I won't let him touch my face." Those words made the atmosphere dead silent. To Carson, it was a stab straight at professional ethics, as he always protected his staff, no matter who they were. More seriously, Russell refused to appear with Rock Hudson, whom insiders knew was gay, though the public hadn't confirmed it yet. "I won't sit next to him," she said bluntly. Accompanied by derogatory words the crew could hardly forget. Carson, who had many friends in the LGBTQ+ community, felt truly outraged. The final straw came in 1973. During a break, with mics off, Jane Russell disparaged the civil rights movement, and those words reached many staff ears. Minutes later, it got to Carson. He didn't yell, didn't make a scene, but from that day, Jane Russell disappeared from The Tonight Show's guest list. For a major star, this was heavy punishment, and Carson never regretted it. In Carson's eyes, Jane Russell was clear proof that talent and beauty couldn't cover toxic thoughts. He once said privately to the producer, "Audiences can forgive ego, but cruelty, discrimination, never." And if Jane Russell made Carson disgusted with her extreme attitude, then the final name on the list stirred in him the strongest emotion. Not just disappointment, but contempt. That was Jerry, one of America's greatest comedians, who brought laughter to millions, who organized famous telethons to raise funds for children with illnesses. His public image was a dedicated artist, full of compassion, always energetic. But to Johnny Carson and the Tonight Show crew, Jerry Lewis was the truly most hateful face. Carson once bluntly, "He's proof that when ego outstrips talent, what's left is disaster." On air, Jerry Lewis often interrupted, talked over, even tried to steal the spotlight from Carson and other guests. In one taping, he unexpectedly reached out to adjust Carson's tie right on live TV. To others, it might be harmless fun, but to Carson, who extremely hated being touched without permission, this was nothing short of provocation. And everyone knew Lewis did it just to assert power. Worse, the way Lewis treated the behind-the-scenes crew outraged everyone. He rarely called staff by name, instead pointing and barking, "Hey, cameraman! You, makeup girl!" One time, when a cameraman accidentally coughed lightly during rehearsal, Jerry Lewis stopped, yelled, "You breathe like an amateur! Get him out now!" The poor cameraman was just allergic. The whole studio was stunned, and Carson was so angry he had to intervene. What made Carson hate most wasn't just the arrogance, but the hypocrisy. He once said, "I see Jerry shed tears on TV, saying he loves children, but right after, he steps backstage and treats people like trash. That's what disgusts me." After Jerry Lewis's final appearance in the early 80s, Carson was firm. Never again. And indeed, Jerry Lewis vanished from the guest seat, becoming one of the rare few Carson banned completely. Years later, at a private party, when someone asked about Lewis, Carson coldly replied, "In a town full of fakes, he still stands out as the truly hateful one." And that's not easy to achieve. With Jerry Lewis, Carson's blacklist closes, but the story doesn't stop at those individuals. It reflects a larger truth. Behind the brilliant glamour, golden-era Hollywood was also rife with dark corners, where power, arrogance, and cruelty were cleverly hidden behind smiles and the glow of fame. Dear viewers, the story of Johnny Carson and his blacklist of 9 golden-era stars has shown us a Hollywood truly different from the sparkling picture on screen. Behind the radiant smiles and dazzling lights, there are people who chose to use power, fame, and glamour to hide terrifying dark sides. Johnny Carson, with his sharp eyes and sense of fairness, saw through it all. He clearly distinguished between artistic ego and cruelty toward the weaker, and that's what makes his story incredibly valuable to us today. If you feel these revelations shed light on a hidden corner of Hollywood, please hit the like button to support the channel, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos.